Well, God is calling, are you listening? Now, many of us will have a mobile phone. And when a call or a message comes, we usually don't wait to answer it, unless we have a really good reason, or at least to see who it is. And not to leave anybody out, for those of you who only have a landline, when you come home and you see the message light flashing or the call light flashing, you're pretty quick to go and pick up those messages. Well, how many of us have a phone that looks something like that? And we might wonder why. Why is this person not getting all of these calls and messages? Well, I mean, they could be away on a holiday and just decided to ignore their phone for a while. Or maybe they're focusing on other things like work or personal activities. They're just too busy with life to pay attention to their phone. Or maybe this person really is only interested in others getting their calls. They're not interested in answering calls. They only think what is important is their thoughts and what they have to say. Or it could be that this person is ignoring messages from one particular person, and the recipient is receiving all the other calls, but ignoring this one very persistent caller. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I put to you that God is calling out to all of us, and personally, and in a very real way. And he's interested in those who will listen to what he has to say. You know, it even says in his word that God at the first did visit the Gentiles, or really what he's saying, all the nations of the world, to take out of them a people for his name. He was calling for a people, because what God has to say is, without exaggerating, life-altering. He's looking to those who will listen and who want to be involved in something more than just their own way of life and their own views, and instead want to associate themselves with his name and his principles and his way of life. Now, hopefully your Bible is still open to Romans chapter 1, because there are some interesting things put forward there by the Apostle Paul, who wrote the book of Romans. We're just going to do that right now. And in Romans chapter 1, at verse 16, Paul is talking about salvation, because we're in a hopeless state, which is that we're all doomed to die because of our sinfulness. And the gospel, this message of good news of the plan that he has for those who will take him up on it, is the only solution out of that dilemma. And so Paul is writing to a group who is interested in being a people of God's name. And he's writing in first century Rome. Now, if you know anything about Rome at this time, you'll know that it was a very ungodly place, a place filled with excess, with immorality, with idols. Because believing in a one almighty, all-powerful God was just not fashionable. It was a sign of being irrational. It was a sign of illogical thinking, and in fact, it was ridiculed in those days. And it freed people from the constraints of morals and the principles of God. You know, we might say that first century Rome at that time was not at all unlike our world today, where people are ridiculed for believing in the existence of God and not believing in evolution. Well, Paul says he was not ashamed at all of the gospel of Christ, which meant believing in the existence in an eternal and almighty and all-wise God who created the world and teaches us morality and righteousness and principles of living, and who sent his Son to save us from eternal death, he was not ashamed of it. And what's more, he says that this gospel had the power to do just that, to teach us a way. But it was conditional because it was only to those who believe. And the Greek word for believe, pisteo, means not just to believe, but to give credence to be persuaded of, to place one's confidence in, to trust in and rely on. That's the kind of belief Paul is talking about. And notice he says it's to the Gentiles as well, to every nationality, which is just what the Apostle James said in our previous verse. Well, in verse 18, this positive message had a limit. You see, Paul says that it will change to a message of wrath. Because if we ignore the message of God, then his wrath will be revealed to those who, it says, hold the truth in unrighteousness. The word hold literally means to hold down. And unrighteousness is a legal term that means injustice or moral wrongfulness. And so quite literally, the expression was to those who hold down the truth about God and instead cause moral wrongfulness to spread. And so in verse 19, it's because that which may be known of God is shown to them, not in them, but to them. In other words, every day, Paul says, God is calling us. Well, he goes on to explain how. He says in verse 20, it's because that the things of God, the things which can't be seen, a God which can't be seen, are seen by the things we see in the creation around us. They're clearly seen, in fact, he says. So we should be able to understand the wonder of our God by looking at the created world around us. It's the reality of a living God has been written, as it were, into the works of the creation. And so he says we are without excuse. The Greek means we're without a defense for not believing in and listening to God. And so in verse 21, because he says when a man looks at the creation, he can't help but realize that there's a creator. But instead of admitting it, he says they deny it and become vain, which means to be an empty thinker or foolish. And in verse 22, he says they profess wisdom but become fools. You know, the Jerusalem Bible is quite a bit more blunt. It says, the more they call themselves philosophers, the more stupid they grow, is what the Jerusalem Bible says. And so in verse 23, rather than give glory to an immortal, all-powerful creator, they put the things of the creation, which are weak and mortal and dying, at a higher and more important level. So I'm just going to put up on the screen the NET translation for this passage. Maybe speaks a little more plainly, for it says in verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of people who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness. Because that which can be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen because they are understood through that which has been made. And so people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God or give him thanks, but they became futile in their thoughts, and in their senseless hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for an image resembling mortal human beings or birds or four-footed animals or reptiles. Now let me ask you a question. In the theory of evolution, what is the epitome? What's the pinnacle of the evolutionary process? Why, it's mortal man. Now, is that not exchanging the glory of an immortal God for an image of mortal human beings? And so Paul says, all should know, all should acknowledge God as their creator. And the evidence of what we see should convince all of us that there is a power far greater than any, and we ought to acknowledge our dependence upon that power for our very existence. Because we can see and understand this clearly by looking at the things that are made, he says, in the world around us. It's as though every day, by the evidence of creation, God says, choose you this day whom you will serve. Because there's no excuse for not understanding that I exist. And so indeed, God is calling. Are we listening? Well, how does God do the calling? We're going to look at 3 examples of how God calls us by his creation and leaves us with, really, when we think about it, no doubt that he's a creator. So in Psalm 19, we read these verses, that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork. Day unto day, they utter speech. It's like the heavens are calling on behalf of God. And night unto night showeth knowledge. There's no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. Their line is gone out through all the earth, their words to the end of the world. In them hath he set a tabernacle for the sun, which is as a bridegroom coming out of his chamber, and rejoiceth as a strong man to run a race. Now, all of us, or perhaps many of us, have been out on a starlit night when you're away from all the light pollution of the cities around us. And it's a glorious thing to behold, isn't it? Well, there's a lot of discussion these days about the temperature of the earth. And yet one wonders if anybody thinks about the factors that keep the earth at a habitable temperature. The things that, when all put together, certainly declare the handiwork of God. A way for him to call out to us, for us to pause and consider his calling. So what is it about earth that is able to keep us at the proper temperature? Well, one thing is water. How unusual that our earth is the only known planet with liquid water. Some 340 million cubic miles of liquid water. And not only does it carry minerals and nutrients that are needed for life, it captures and holds heat. But it's also reflective. And so relative to land masses, it captures heat and releases it much more slowly. It keeps the equatorial regions cooler and the polar regions a little warmer. It moderates the temperature to keep most of the Earth habitable. Well, the Earth is tilted on its axis, 23.5 degrees, the scientists say, and it causes the 4 seasons. But also, if its axis were perpendicular, the equator would be too hot, and more of the poles would be covered in ice. If the tilt were double, close to 25 degrees, there'd be extreme at the mid-latitudes, around the areas that we live in. And we would have polar-like winters with 24 hours of darkness and unbearably hot summers with 24 hours of light. But this 23.5 degree tilt strikes just the right balance for life over the greatest regions of the Earth. Well, what about the atmosphere? The atmosphere has the proper mixes of gas. They're at the proper density. It's at the proper thickness, which, by the way, if the Earth were the size of an apple, that 600-mile thickness of the atmosphere, they say, is less than the thickness of the skin of an apple. That's how large the Earth is. So it's the right thickness, and the atmosphere also reflects the right amount of radiation from the sun. It keeps the right amount of UV and cosmic rays from reaching us, and it traps just the right amount of heat to keep our temperature at the right temperature, our Earth at the right temperature. But the greatest effect on the temperature of the Earth is that it's the proper distance from the sun. Now, before we discuss that, just a few thoughts about the distances that we're talking about here. So there's a shot of our solar system, and it shows the different orbits of the Earth, of the planets around the sun. But just to get a sense of our size that we're talking about, so our galaxy is called the Milky Way. Now, if our solar system could be shrunk down to the size that would fit into our hand, our Milky Way galaxy would be as large as North America. That's the size of just the Milky Way. And our galaxy is by no means a very large galaxy. And the next nearest star in our Milky Way galaxy, it's called Proxima Centauri. If the sun were the size of a golf ball, then that nearest star would be about 1,200 kilometers away. So from the red dot to the white dot near the bottom in South Carolina. The red dot is where we are. Now back to our solar system. Every diagram that you've ever seen of a solar system is not proportionate. You see, the Earth's orbit is an average of 150 million kilometers from the sun. Now, just to give you a perspective here, if this were a proportionate size of the sun, the Earth would be the blue dot. And I'm not sure how many of you can see it, but the blue dot that's on this little square piece of paper. So we're going to ask Brother Tom to come here and take the Earth. Now, the Earth, we said, is on average 150 million kilometers away. So if this is the size of the sun, how far does Brother Tom need to walk back in the room to get to where the orbit of the Earth would be represented? So just start walking slowly. Somebody can shout out when you should stop. That Earth stays at the right orbit around the sun. Well, scientists estimate that if the Earth were 1.5 million kilometers closer or farther than the sun, to the sun, then the Earth would be uninhabitable. 1.5 million kilometers is 1% of 150 million kilometers. That's like moving our Earth and our sun 8 inches closer. 8 inches closer or 8 inches farther, and the Earth is either dry and arid and we can't live there, or freezing cold and we can't live there. And yet, the Earth continues to orbit at the right distance around the sun. Now, is that not a case of the heavens declaring the glory of God? The firmament showing his handiwork, where day unto day it utters its speech, and night unto night it shows knowledge. And there is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. So is not God calling us? And are we listening? Well, our second example. Our second example is going to be taken from a scientist whose name was Leonardo Fibonacci. And he was a scientist who thought that he would count the number of rabbits that reproduce in 1 year. And what he found was that the rabbits reproduce at a certain number. And so he was able to find a sequence which has now been called the Fibonacci sequence. So you start it with 0 rabbits, then you add 1 rabbit, which adds 1 rabbit, which then adds 2 rabbits. But the interesting thing about this sequence is it follows a case where the previous 2 numbers, when added together, make the next number. So 0 plus 1 is 1. And 1 plus 1 is 2. And 1 plus 2 is 3. And so on. 2 plus 3 is 5. 5 plus 8 is 13. 8 plus 13 is 21. And so on, all the way up, and it goes on to infinity. That's the Fibonacci sequence. But what's also interesting is this sequence can be used to calculate a ratio, where if the previous number divided by the next number is done, then you come up with this sequence. And it's more accurate with the larger numbers. So 144 divided by 233 will be very close to 0.61803. Now, what's astounding here is how many times these sequences and ratios come up in the creation. So, for example, when you look at flower petals, you will always see that flower petals are either 3 or 5 or 8 or 13 or 21. They're always according to the Fibonacci sequence. And so the Irish say, how lucky you are to find a 4-leaf clover because they're so rare, because they're always 3-leaf clovers. And also flowers with seed heads. Now, this flower, first of all, you'll notice it has 13 petals, which is a Fibonacci number. But if you count the seed heads, you'll notice that they spiral in one direction, clockwise, and there are, 13 of them. But if you count them in the other direction, they would spiral counterclockwise, and there's 21, the very next Fibonacci number. And it's also seen in pine cones, where if you count the spirals in one way, in that pine cone there's 8, and in the other way there's 13, 2 Fibonacci numbers. When you look at the way a tree grows from the tree trunk, Well, as it grows, the trunk splits and grows into one branch, which then creates two growth points. But then the one of the new stems branches into two, while the other one lies dormant. And then the pattern is created to then follow the Fibonacci sequence. Now, what's more, this Fibonacci ratio can be used to create rectangles according to the size of the Fibonacci sequence, which then can be used to form an algorithmic spiral, which, interestingly, abounds in creation. So in addition to those flower heads that we saw earlier, which seem to spiral, we can see examples of shells, conch cells, or snail cells that have this Fibonacci spiral. Galaxies that are spiraled, like our Milky Way, seem to fit the dimensions of the Fibonacci ratio. Hurricanes, when they form, are of the same ratio. Now, what do we make of this? Well, when a company makes a product, they stamp their logo on it. Think of an Apple iPhone. But then they stamp their logo on all their products, their iPods and their iPads and their this and their that, so that all who sees it will know that they're made by the same manufacturer. It's almost as if these numbers and ratios are God's signature to show that there's a single creator who's calling to us. But are we listening? Well, lastly, our final example is taken from the flora and the fauna. Now, a number of years ago, the very first kids camp workbook was put out, and it was called Flora and Fauna. And someone here might know the exact year, 1972, 3, somewhere in there, I'm not sure. I'm looking there, but not getting any help. So on this topic, there's one page in this workbook that has always caught my eye, because I think it was way ahead of its time, and that is the woodpecker. And the woodpecker is shown as a classic example of something called irreducible complexity. Now, that term wasn't even around in the 70s, and it wasn't introduced until the 90s by a scientist named Michael Behe. And Michael Behe defined irreducible complexity this way: a single system which is composed of several interacting parts that contribute to the basic function, and where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to effectively cease functioning. Which, by the way, Charles Darwin in his first book admitted that if someone could find that to be the case in a number of animals, this would prove his theory incorrect. So, an example of irreducible complexity is a mousetrap. Because if you take one of the parts away, it's no longer a working mousetrap. If you take the wooden base away, it's got nothing to attach to, it doesn't work. If you take the spring off, it doesn't work. If you take the hammer that comes down and kills the mouse, if you remove that, it's no longer a mousetrap. So it's irreducibly complex. You can't take one part of it away. Now, the reason why we have the Swiss Army knife there is it's an example of something that's complex, but it's not irreducibly complex. In other words, you can take one blade out of a Swiss Army knife, and you can still use the other blades. They're not dependent on each other the way the parts of a mousetrap are. Well, what is it about the woodpecker that makes it irreducibly complex? And the question is, how in the world does this bird peck without bashing its brains out? Because the force that it pecks against the wood at has been measured at over, and I couldn't believe it, I read it 3 times, over 1,000 times the force of gravity when its head hits the wood. And it does it at 25 times per second. And the reason why it can do this is because it's a complex pieces of equipment all working together. Well, what is that? Well, first of all, it's the woodpecker's stance. And if you ever see a woodpecker line up on a tree, you'll notice that before they start pecking, they dip their tail feathers backwards against the tree trunk. And in fact, their tail feathers are pointed to allow for this resting motion against the tree. Because when a woodpecker does this and it pecks, the muscles in its neck absorb the shock of the pecking from its head and then transmit it to its shoulders, its torso, into its tail, and then back into the tree. And it's like this circular dispersion of energy that leaves the tree and goes right back in the tree and just travels through the body of the woodpecker. Well, as we said, woodpeckers have very strong necks, super strong neck muscles to divert and absorb the shock. They've done some microscopic cross-sections of the bones in the skull of a woodpecker. And actually the one on the right is a normal bird, and you'll notice how sort of wide and flimsy their skull looks, whereas this one, it's kind of compact, but there's lots of little air pockets in there, and the plates on the top and the bottom look very robust. Well, the brains of a woodpecker are protected by their skull bone. And inside the bone, there's quite a bit of spongy bones, and it's layered in plates, and it all acts like a shock-absorbing helmet. Not only that, woodpeckers have tongues that actually wrap around their skulls. But at the part that goes around their skull, it's called a hyoid bone. Now, we have one. It's this bone right here that kind of sticks out, and you can put your finger on it. It feels hard. That's a hyoid bone. And on us, that bone is just used for a muscle attachment that helps us with our swallowing and supports our tongue. But in woodpeckers, that bone is modified to be super long. And it starts at its nasal cavities and as 2 separate bones where it then attaches, and these bones then run over and around their brain, around the side of their head, under the lower part of their jaw, and into their mouth where it becomes their tongue. And you see, when a woodpecker pecks, those tongue bones that start around its nasal and go around its head stabilizes its skull and acts almost like a seat belt. And it absorbs the shock when the skull hits the tree. It coils back and flexes, and it acts like a seat belt for its skull. Well, not only that, they've found that woodpeckers, there it is, on the top picture, I'm not sure if you can see that, but in the top picture, woodpeckers have an overbite. That is to say, their beak is made of 2 layers. There's an inner layer of really strong, dense bone and an outer layer of flexible tissue that's a bit softer. And the upper beak is slightly longer than the lower beak. That's their overbite. But the lower beak is actually a bit stronger and harder and denser. And then when you put the hyphoid bone, around, so from the beak, the hyphoid bone goes around here, goes into their beak, and then forms into their tongue. The impact of the shock travels from the outer spongy material into their hard supporting bone, through that hyphoid bone and around their head, and then back into their lower bone and tongue. So in other words, the point is, if you and I were to hit our head the way a woodpecker does, the force would strike us right in the middle of our brain, right there where our brain is. But for a woodpecker, the force starts here, and the force is transmitted around its skull and ends up in its lower beak, surrounding its brain, but never really going through its brain, going through the bones that are around the brain. And not only that, woodpeckers have long brains. They don't have round, fat brains. Long brains that are elongated, which help to minimize the shock. And woodpeckers have very little fluid in their brain. Most animals, including us, have a fair amount of cerebral fluid to allow our brain to float inside the cavity of our skull, whereas the woodpecker has very little space between its brain and its skull, so that there is not much room for it to float around and not much space for it to move within its skull. Not only that, woodpeckers have goggles, we might say. Because yes, like us, they have an upper lid and a lower lid. They also have a third lid, which is a horizontal eyelid. And it moves horizontally across the eye and closes about a millisecond before the beak hits the tree. And what that does is it helps to keep the debris out of their eye and keeps their eyeballs from popping out of their head. Now, researchers have determined that when you put all of this equipment together, this irreducibly complex system, we might say, absorbs 99.7% of the shock of their pounding, which leaves 0.3% of the shock that actually goes into their brain and their head. Now, lastly, why do they peck? They're getting into trees because in the trees, there's little burrows of bugs, and they eat the bugs. Well, once they make a hole in a tree, they have to have a tongue to get at the bugs that are in the tree. And so when they chisel a small opening, they then slide their tongue into the tunnel. And their tongue is coated with a very sticky saliva. It's also coated with barbs that face backward. So if the tongue brushes up against a bug, or sometimes it'll actually go through a bug, the barbs will bring the bug back, plus the sticky saliva will bring the bug back. And sometimes they say the tongue could even wrap around a bug, a larger one, and bring it back into its mouth. The point is, all of these complex systems are working together. And you can't take a single one of them away. They're all needed for the woodpecker to succeed. And in fact, if you were to take even one part of it away, it is then at a disadvantage to other birds for getting food and surviving. And if it tried to bore for insects without all of its parts working together, it would not survive. Well, we'd like to bring our thoughts to a close. Because you see, that which can be known about God is plain to us, because God has made it plain to us. Because since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes and even God himself, his eternal power and his divine nature have been clearly seen, because they are understood through that which has been made. And so we're left with no defense other than to believe in the existence of an almighty creator who is God. And so we invite you to look deeper into this. God is calling. He wants you to listen. But you see, what he has to say is, quite frankly, without exaggerating, a life-altering message. And he's looking for those who will listen and who want to be involved in something more than just their own way of life and their own views, and instead wants to be associated with God's principles and God's way and God's name. Because he's calling, but are you listening?